Welcome to today's professional development, which is going to be a breakdown of Texas's school budget system. Schools get funding from three main sources. They get those fundings from local school district property taxes, state funds, and federal funds. This graph shows a breakdown of how state funds are allocated. As you can see, education receives 39% of state expenditures. A large portion of our tax money goes into our education system. The pink and blue portions of this graph show education funds. Once taxes are paid, there's a very calculated, multi-tiered process to determine how that money is allocated to the various districts and schools throughout the state. There are two tiers in this system. Tier 1 is supposed to provide districts adequate funding to deliver a basic education program. However, almost all districts find they cannot provide an adequate level of education within their Tier 1 funding and must increase their tax rate in order to access Tier 2 funding just to make ends meet. The following slides, I'll give you a breakdown of Tier 1 and Tier 2 funding. Within Tier 1 funding, there's a program set up to calculate the amounts to allocate to districts within the state. That program is referred to as the Foundation School Program, or FSP. FSP is the main organization that handles funding and distribution of money to districts within Tier 1. How this system works is through a long process of collecting data, running the numbers, and recalculating those formulas to ensure equity of distribution. The first step is through data collection subsystems, which gather data from external sources. Those sources include local education agencies, or LEAs, school districts, charters, education service centers, or other state agencies. After the data is collected, it is reviewed and sent to the Summary of Finances for approval. The SOF is a calculation engine that crunches the numbers to determine how much money is allocated to school districts in the state. The data submitted in the first step is used to determine how that money is allocated. After SOF reviews the data and determines how much money is allocated to each district, the funds are distributed to the local education agencies. Since the data sent in are estimates, a final step called near-final settle-ups is conducted. These are the calculations that tally how much was paid versus how much was owed based on a complete or nearly complete set of data for the finished school year. Now let's put this into terms that we can all understand in a little bit of a simplified explanation. Basically, data is collected by districts. Superintendents and or CFOs or other representatives are going to collect this data and put it into a system which we know as FSP. This data is then reviewed by district representatives before being sent off to the Texas Education Agency, or TEA. Once TEA receives the data, they also review it for approval. Once it is approved by TEA, allocation amounts are calculated. The data and allocation amounts are then sent off to the internal state accounting system. And then once approved in this final step, money may be distributed to districts. An allotment is basically an amount of money that we set aside for different areas within education. The main areas we allocate our funds in the school system are regular education, special education, career technical education, bilingual or ELL, compensatory education, gifted and talented education, public education grants, transportation, and new instructional facilities. This graph shows us a breakdown of the percentages that are distributed to each of these categories. It's important for us as educators to see how our money is distributed to the various programs. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. This slide shows us the formula that the state uses to calculate the Tier 1 allotments. Basically, the district's basic allotment, let's say it was $4,765. That amount is multiplied by the quotient of the district's compressed tax rate divided by the state's maximum compressed tax rate. So an example would be a district with a CTR of $1 has a basic allotment amount of $4,765. Now to discuss why attendance is so important, not only for students to make adequate growth in social and academic areas, but it also has a direct impact on funding for the school. The average daily attendance rate, also known as ADA, is a formula that calculates how much money the school gets based on attendance. The school loses money when a student is absent. At the same time, the school must still pay for teacher and staff salaries, operation mounts, building maintenance, electricity, and other expenses involved with running a school. The bottom line is attendance is not only important for students to make adequate growth in social and academic skills, but it also affects the funding for our school. The next slides go into a description of Tier 2 funding. Tier 2 funding is a bit more complicated than Tier 1 funding. This diagram shows how Tier 2 funds are calculated. Again, I won't spend a lengthy amount of time on this aspect. I do think it is important to see how those funds are calculated, though. That's a lot of information that I just put on your plate. The big idea on Tier 2 funding has to do with the state trying to establish equity in the districts. There are what we call quote-unquote wealthy properties and quote-unquote poor properties. Basically, the state tries to distribute the wealth more equally so that schools in wealthy property areas don't get all of the funding over schools in poor property areas. This slide goes into detail as to how the states reallocate these funds to distribute them more equally among schools. Some of those measures are to consolidate with other districts, detach property, purchase attendance credits from the state, contract to educate non-resident students from a partner district, and consolidate tax bases with another district. While teachers do not have to know the budget in great detail, it is important for us to understand how the money is allocated on a state level. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, being to make informed decisions on voting and how the state determines tax-related ballots for educational purposes. The budget does have a direct impact on our classrooms. It is important for us to keep apprised on the issues related to funding for our schools so that we can advocate what is needed to ensure our students are able to reach their highest potential. If you want more information on budgets, these websites would be great places to start. Thank you for attending this Professional Development Day. If you have any further questions, please see me.